My name is Alba, and I started working when I was only 16 years old. Not because it was my cherished desire or youthful desire for independence, no, but solely because the circumstances in my life were such that I simply had no choice. My parents, although they were people who were not indifferent to their own needs and pleasures, somehow mysteriously never found the slightest opportunity or desire to spend an extra penny on my needs, whereas for my younger sister Mimi, who was born 6 years after me, new dresses always appeared in the house as if by magic, toys, electronic devices, and even music lessons. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. I remember that day down to the smallest detail, the day when I suddenly realized that I had reached my inner limit, that I no longer wanted to put up with this constant feeling of abandonment and injustice. It happened when I needed a new pair of sneakers for physical education lessons, because my old, battered SS helmets were literally kept honest. However, their soles had almost completely fallen off, and each step was accompanied by the sharp sound of creaking glue. When I plucked up my resolve and asked my mother for money for new sneakers, from the look on her face, one might have thought that I had dared to ask her for a family diamond necklace or at least a designer bag worth half of her annual salary. My mother sighed noisily, opened her worn old purse with exaggerated fatigue in her movements and, with a wry smile lips and a barely noticeable grimace of annoyance, she extracted 3 crumpled tens from it, throwing them on the table as if they were the last thing she had. "Alba, do you think," she said with that special intonation that is usually used when lecturing children, "money grows on trees? Here's $30 for you. Make it work." $30 for a pair of shoes that had to withstand at least 6 months of classes on the concrete and sand playgrounds of the school. I tried to hide my disappointment by lowering my eyes and clenching my fists so that my nails dug into my palms, because I knew that any expression of displeasure would immediately be perceived as ingratitude. Later that day, at home, I found a scene that burned into my memory like a burn. My parents, laughing merrily, were messing with Mimi in the hallway, returning with a noisy armful of shopping bags from the mall. She, beaming with happiness, took out new dresses, a stuffed unicorn in a pink bow and a brand new and electronic tablet for developing thinking, as Dad proudly explained, before plunging into a long story about the important role educational technologies play in the life of a modern child. I stood aside, imperceptibly counting in my mind, 1 dress, another, a third, plus a toy, plus a tablet. In total, they spent at least $300 on it for one trip, and I knew that this was far from an isolated case, while I had to beg for small things and suffer reproaches. Mimi could throw a tantrum in a toy store and easily achieve what she wanted. When it was time for a school trip, which required a modest contribution of $20, my father insisted that I first make him a detailed report on the estimated educational value of the trip, and then, after giving him a long lecture on the importance of financial responsibility and budget planning, regretfully handed over the bill, as if giving away a part of his own soul. The same Mimi herself could make a small scene in the supermarket and take home a whole cartload of sweets and toys, without even getting a comment. It so happened that one day, sitting in the coffee shop of my friend Kiara's parents and trying to finish my literature assignment, I involuntarily overheard them talking about how they needed help on the weekend, and before fear or doubt could stop me, I suddenly, surprising myself, suggested my candidacy out loud. I'm working for you," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. They looked at each other, apparently amazed by my courage and determination, but after a few seconds, after a short discussion, they nodded in agreement, and on the same day I became part of their small team. My new life began imperceptibly. After school and on weekends, I changed into a modest waitress uniform and started working, serving coffee, wiping tables and smiling at customers. I was paid a little, the minimum wage plus a tiny tip, but it was my own money, my first honestly earned money, and a sense of pride in myself it filled me to the brim. I didn't tell anyone about my work, especially my parents, feeling in my gut that if they found out about it, they would not only not support me, but would also find a way to somehow take advantage of my efforts, devalue them, make them someone else's. I worked, saved money, quietly rejoiced at every new bill in a worn piggy bank. Gradually, she bought herself the necessary clothes, a new pair of shoes, and later even opened a small savings account at a local bank. For the first time in my life, I felt that sweet sense of control over my own existence, realizing that I could influence my fate, even if so far by the most modest means. But, as often happens, everything changed in a moment. One Saturday afternoon, when the coffee shop was filled with the rich aroma of freshly roasted beans, and I was bending over the counter, carefully whipping milk for a latte, the door opened with a melodious chime, and they appeared in the doorway, Mom and Mimi. I froze, holding a metal jug in my hands, when my mother's gaze fell on me. Her expression would have been truly comical, full of shock and disbelief, if not for the fear that held me down. "Alba, what are you doing here?" "What is it?" she asked sharply, her voice sounding as if she had caught me doing something unacceptable. "I work here," I replied simply, trying to remain calm, continuing to whip the milk as if nothing had happened. Mom didn't make any orders, she just silently grabbed Mimi's hand and, without turning around, slipped out of the coffee shop, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfumes and heavy condemnation. I knew that dinner that evening would be unforgettable. When I returned home, the silence in the house seemed stretched to the limit, as if it could break at any moment from the first loud word. My parents were already waiting for me in the kitchen, sitting at the table with an expression of seriousness that they usually reserved for family quarrels. The interrogation began immediately, without the slightest preparation. "Why didn't you tell us you were working?" "What is it?" my father asked, trying to speak calmly, but his voice was trembling treacherously from suppressed irritation. I shrugged, not wanting to get into a long explanation. "I didn't think you cared." "Of course we care," Mom interjected, although her tone sounded more accusatory than caring. "They asked me how much I earned, and when, seeing no point in lying, I named the amount of $400 a month along with the tip, I noticed how their expressions changed. Not for the better. There was that special calculating gleam in their eyes that I had previously noticed when they were making a shopping list for Mimi." The father cleared his throat, as if about to say something important, and said, "Since you live under our roof, eat our food, and use our electricity, it's only fair that you contribute. Half of your earnings will go towards family expenses." I stared at him in disbelief. Mom immediately added, "Mimi needs new winter clothes. And we were thinking of enrolling her in dance lessons. You know, it's not cheap." That's when I realized everything. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't about my contribution to the family. They just wanted to take my money to provide Mimi with everything she needed again. I took a deep breath, fighting back tears, and said softly but firmly, "No. It's my money. I earned them myself. I won't give them to you for dancing lessons for Mimi." After that night, everything changed, and if before I could at least hope for parental care in casual gestures or words, now the relationship between me and my parents has finally acquired a cold, formal character. They performed only the minimum set of duties that were necessary so that the law could not accuse them of neglect. That they bought the simplest food for me, bought the cheapest clothes only when the old ones finally fell into disrepair, and left a roof over my head, but otherwise I seemed to cease to exist for them, became invisible, unnecessary, superfluous in your own home. When the choir performed at school, to which other students brought crowds of relatives with flowers and applause, my parents did not bother to appear, and when I won the school essay contest, putting my whole soul into it and receiving praise from the teachers, I was greeted at home only by the usual silence, full of indifference. It was as if I had been demoted from my daughter. An unwanted guest, and every evening I felt it more and more acutely, passing by the closed doors of their rooms and hearing them laughing with Mimi, as if I were just a shadow randomly wandering through their house. Fortunately, my grandmother Justina was in my life, my father's mother, a woman with such an amazing reserve of kindness and strength that I had never seen in anyone else. She noticed my loneliness and began to appear at my school events, loudly applauding and shouting my name, so sometimes I even felt a little it was awkward, but deep down I felt warm gratitude for every word she said, for every sincere smile. Sometimes, on Sundays, she would take my hand and lead me to a small cafe on the corner, where we would choose 2 or 3 ice cream balls, sit at a table by the window and talk for hours about school, about life, about my dreams, and in those moments I felt that all was not lost. That there is still a place for love and acceptance in this world. By the last year of school, I was working almost full-time. In the evenings after school and early in the morning on weekends, I stood at the counter of a coffee shop, learned to smile at customers, even when I was so tired that my legs could barely support me, and at the same time I diligently saved almost all the money I earned for the future, realizing that the only chance to break out of this vicious circle was to go to college and discover a different life for myself. I filled out endless scholarship applications, looking for all possible ways that could help me realize my dream. On the day of graduation, my parents did come, but only for 5 minutes, just long enough to take a couple of photos on their phones, after which Dad, glancing at his watch and noticing that time was running out, announced that they had promised to take Mimi to the cinema, because she had so patiently endured all these boring ceremonies. They left before my name was even heard from the stage, but Grandma Justina stayed, jumped up and down and shouted my name with such pride and joy that I almost burst into tears right on stage, and then invited me to dinner at a beautiful restaurant, where we sat for a long time at a table by the window, enjoying a holiday that really was mine. 2 weeks passed, and at one of the rare family dinners where the atmosphere was tense and cold, as always, I gathered all my courage and decided to share the news that I had been carrying around for a long time, fearing that otherwise this moment would never come. I said that I had enrolled in a state university and that I would start going to study in August. Dad, without looking up from his plate, interrupted me in mid-sentence, as if he had endured this confession only in order to express the words he had prepared for a long time. We can't afford college. Not including Mimi's private school tuition. His voice was flat, without emotion, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years, as if he didn't care what hopes and dreams I had associated with this admission. I smiled, but it wasn't a joyful smile, but rather an expression of inner victory. I don't need your money, I said calmly. I got a full scholarship. Everything is provided. The forks in the parents' hands froze halfway to their mouths, as if they had stopped understanding what was happening for a moment. Silence hung in the air, heavy and strange, until finally Mom, not knowing what to say, said, "Well, it makes you very happy." And then, as if my words were nothing, she turned to Mimi with a strange smile. "Darling, tell Alba about your scientific project." Mimi, beaming with pride, began to talk animatedly about her volcano, made entirely of purchased materials, about its eruption, for which she received the first place in the class, and I sat listening to her cheerful voice, and suddenly realized that I no longer feel anything. No anger, no pain, no resentment. The emptiness spread inside me like a smooth, warm ocean without waves. The next day, without further ado, I packed my things into several bags and moved in with Grandma Justine, who greeted me on her doorstep with open arms, as if I had returned home after a long journey. This summer was the best for me in many years. I continued to work in a coffee shop, carefully saving every dollar I earned for my upcoming studies, and living with my grandmother was like relaxing after a long and hard hike. She treated me not as a burden, not as an accidental problem, but as a living person, to a girl whose feelings and dreams mattered. One evening, when we were sitting on the swing of her cozy porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in incredible shades of pink and gold, Grandma suddenly turned to me and, as if making an important decision, said, "I will send you $1,000 every month to pay for housing. And don't you dare argue with me about it." "Grandma, this is too much," I tried to object, genuinely shocked by her generosity and care. But she just waved her hand as if to ward off an annoying fly. "What else should I do with my money? Your grandfather left me a rich legacy, and I intend to use it to help those I love. And you, my dear Alba, are at the very top of this list." And so, in August, I put my simple belongings in the trunk of my grandmother's old car and went to the state university, towards a new life, a new freedom. The campus greeted me with green lawns and old red brick buildings, and although my tiny dorm room was cramped and modest, it seemed to me like a real palace. My roommate, Ines, was from sunny California. She turned out to be a quiet, polite girl, with whom we immediately established a friendly, albeit slightly restrained relationship. We were not destined to become best friends, but we respected each other's personal space, and for me that was the most important thing, to finally have a place where I could be myself, where no one tried to control my life or take away my dreams. During the 4 years of college, I called Grandma Justine twice a week, and these conversations were for me the elusive bridge to the house that I never really had. We discussed my studies, my plans, successes, and even minor failures, and Grandma always knew what to say to support, to give me confidence, or just to make me smile after a hard day. My parents, on the contrary, called perhaps once a month, and conversations with them were devoid of warmth. They sounded strained and formal, as if we were strangers connected only by last name. Mom always asked the same thing: "How are your classes going?" To which I always answered with short answers, not wanting to go into details, because I knew that she wasn't particularly interested. "That's sweet," she would usually remark with a slight strain in her voice, and then, almost without hiding her joy, she would turn to her favorite topic: "Did I tell you that Mimi got on the honor roll again?" And it was like this every time, as if my existence made sense only in comparison with the successes of my younger sister, and everything I achieved myself was too insignificant to waste time or words on. They never came to my college, they didn't attend any parent-teacher weekends, and on those days I stayed with friends whose families were also busy or couldn't afford the trip. We joked about it, calling ourselves the Orphans Club, and made it a point to have a little party on weekends like this. We put on our best clothes and went to restaurants, enjoying expensive dishes and laughing until we cried, proving to ourselves that we were worth something too. I majored in business with an emphasis on financial management, worked hard, did not allow myself to miss a single deadline, not a single completed project below my capabilities, and eventually graduated from the university with honors, which I had secretly dreamed of all these many years. After graduation, I immediately started looking for a job, because I knew that returning to my hometown without a decent reason would mean giving up positions, a loss that I could not forgive myself. However, fate played a strange trick on me. One day I received a job offer from Financial, one of the leading companies in our region, and when I shared the news with my college mentor, she confidently said, "Take it. They rarely hire new graduates. Someone out there must have been really impressed with your resume." And so I returned to my hometown, but, of course, I chose an apartment as far away from my parents' house as possible. I couldn't afford anything luxurious, but it was my place, my refuge, which I furnished the way I wanted, for the first time in my life feeling fully entitled to manage my space. I didn't call my parents to tell them about my return. Why would I do that if even my graduation went unnoticed by them? Grandma Justina, of course, was thrilled to find out that I was around again. She came to me on the very first evening, hugged me so tightly that I could hardly hold back tears, and brought me enough homemade food to last me a week. "Now I can fatten you up properly," she joked, arranging containers in the tiny kitchen of my apartment, making the space fill with the smells of fresh pastries and spicy meat. My job at Financial turned out to be difficult, but incredibly valuable. I started out as a junior financial analyst, which, in fact, meant doing all the dirty work that more experienced employees would not agree to: endless calculations, checking reports, making last-minute presentations. I stayed late, arrived before everyone else, volunteered for projects that others had rejected, and I knew that this path, even if it was difficult, was the only one that led to real success. It took 2 years of hard work before I got my first promotion to senior analyst, and with it my own small office, a solid pay raise, and even more responsibilities, but instead of relaxing, I just redoubled my efforts, trying to prove that I deserved it for a reason. One day, Mr. Orlando, the head of our department, called me into his office, and when I entered, trying to be confident, he said, "Alba, I'm putting you in charge of Ruggiero's account." My heart almost stopped. Richardson Enterprises was one of the largest and most demanding clients of our company. "Are you sure?" I asked in disbelief. He smiled out of the corner of his lips, but his eyes were serious. "Absolutely. You deserve this chance. Just don't screw up." I knew there was a serious warning behind his smile. This assignment was a test, and a lot depended on success. For the next 3 months, I literally lived and breathed the Ruggiero account, redesigning their entire investment portfolio, finding ways to increase profitability and minimize risks, consulting with lawyers, analysts, and external consultants to ensure that every figure in my plan was perfect. When the day of the presentation to their board of directors came, the room fell into heavy silence as soon as I finished my speech. A minute of silence seemed like an eternity before Mr. Ruggiero finally said, "Finally, I think we've found our new financial advisor." At that moment, I could barely resist crying with relief and pride. We not only saved their business, but also increased their investments in us by 30%. Mr. Orlando was overjoyed. He called a general meeting of the company to celebrate my achievement, presented me with an impressive bonus, and raised my salary again, making it clear that I was becoming an important part of the team. That evening, without hesitation, I called Grandma Justina to share my joy with her. "I knew you could do it," she said proudly, and I could almost hear her eyes filling with tears of joy. "Now, please tell me that you're going to take a vacation. You deserve it." "Actually, yes," I laughed. "And I have something for you, too." The next day, I came to her with 2 envelopes in my hands. One contained a beautiful, sparkling diamond bracelet, a modest gesture of gratitude to a woman who always believed in me, and the other contained 2 tickets for a luxury cruise in Alaska. "You and me," I explained, when Grandma opened the second envelope in complete amazement. Her eyes shone with happiness, and her lips trembled with emotion. The following month, all expenses were paid, and for the first time in my life, I saw my grandmother Justina speechless when I showed her our tickets and told her about my travel plans, because she was usually a woman of her word, easily finding what to say in any situation. But at that moment, looking at 2 tiny rectangles of paper, she just pressed her palms to her face and sat down in her favorite chair on the veranda, still unable to believe that such a gift was meant for her. Our cruise turned out to be even better than I could have imagined. We saw majestic glaciers sparkling in the rays of the northern sun, watched whales rise from the icy waters like huge shadows, and at night, standing on the deck, we watched in fascination as the dance of the northern lights bloomed above us, so incredible that it seemed unreal. I rarely posted anything on social media, always preferring to keep personal moments in my memory, but this time I couldn't resist. I wanted not only to preserve vivid memories of our journey, but also, I admit, to show off a little to the world, to declare myself, to show everyone who once considered me a nobody that I now live a different life. 3 days after our return, when I was still unpacking my bags and sorting through the photos, my phone suddenly rang, and a number that I had seen so rarely that at first I didn't even recognize it appeared on the screen. It was my mother. "Mom?" I said, genuinely surprised, bringing the phone to my ear. "Alba, dear," her voice was sickly sweet, like candied syrup, and immediately alerted me. "It's been too long. Actually, we were hoping that you would come to dinner with us this Sunday. Your dad will be grilling steaks." I should have said no right then. My instinct told me that the sudden interest in my existence after so many years of indifference could not have been accidental, but curiosity, reinforced by the remnants of once warm feelings, prevailed. "Of course," I replied. "What time?" 6 o'clock, dear. And, Alba, we are so proud of you. We always knew that you would succeed." The lie was so blatant that I didn't even bother to comment on it, just politely said goodbye and hung up, feeling a slight shiver of disappointment run down my spine. That Sunday, I went to my parents' house, feeling a strange sense of detachment, as if I were returning not to my family, but to someone else's faded decor of memories. The house looked exactly the same as on the day I left, the same tarnished blue paint, the same flower beds that my mother so carefully cultivated, the same basketball court. A basket by the garage meant, of course, for Mimi, not for me, because I was never athletic enough by my father's standards. Mom opened the door before I could knock. Her smile was wide, strained, almost artificial, and Dad was standing behind her, and to my surprise, he really looked happy, as if he was genuinely glad to see me, which only increased my inner confusion. "Alba!" Mom exclaimed, wrapping me in a hug, a little tighter than necessary. "You look amazing. She's so professional and successful." I awkwardly hugged her back, automatically muttering thanks, not knowing how to react to this wave of unexpected warmth. They took me inside, offered me drinks and snacks, as if I were an honored guest who had come from far away, and not their daughter, who grew up within these walls, and had surprisingly light conversations about the weather, local news, and neighbors, avoiding any mention of the past or family. Finally, when we sat down at the table, Dad cleared his throat, as if about to say something particularly important, and asked, "So, Alba, tell us about your work. You work at Financial, right? As a kind of manager?" I carefully avoided giving specific answers to his questions about my position and salary, knowing full well that there was a certain interest behind the friendly mask, and I smiled and answered vaguely, "I'm fine. The company is wonderful." Wanting to steer the conversation back to safety, I hurried to ask, "How's Mimi? Is she here?" The change of subject worked almost instantly. The parents' faces, which had just been beaming with strange smiles, suddenly dimmed, replaced by an anxious expression. "Actually," Mom began with a heavy sigh, obviously choosing her words, "Mimi goes to college in Westfield. We had to take out a fairly substantial loan to pay for her education, housing, food, and textbooks." Dad apparently felt the need to add his own. "The economy has hit my business hard. We're barely keeping up with our mortgage payments, and now these college bills." I put down my fork, listening to the tension building in my parents' voices, which confirmed my suspicions about the true reason for this dinner. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said calmly. "College is really expensive." They exchanged glances, quick, full of silent agreement, and Mom, reaching across the table, took my hand in hers. "Alba, dear," she began, her voice trembling with emotion, "we know that we were not the most caring parents. We made mistakes, terrible mistakes. The way we treated you compared to Mimi was unfair." I sat there, letting their words wash over me, not reacting outwardly, but feeling a strange mixture of cold analysis and deft disbelief inside, trying to figure out if they really repented or if they just desperately needed my help. "We're so proud of you," Mom continued, her eyes glistening with suppressed tears. "And we hope that you will be able to find the strength in your heart to help your family, until we get back on our feet." And that's when it finally became clear. That's the real reason for the sudden family reunion. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell them in a cold voice that everyone makes their own bed and then has to lie in it, that their choices, their actions, their inability to see me as a person are now coming back to them like a boomerang, but something inside stopped me. Perhaps it was an echo of the words of Grandma Justina, who always reminded me that you should not let bitterness and resentment settle in your heart forever, because then we become no better than those who once hurt us, or perhaps it was a simple, piercing realization that now I can already allow help yourself to them without harming your future, without jeopardizing your dreams and goals. "How much do you need?" I asked calmly, forcing myself to maintain an even, almost businesslike tone. And at that moment, the relief that flooded their faces was so obvious that even Dad, always strict and restrained, could not hide his emotions and almost burst into tears right at the table. Mom pressed her palms to her chest, as if begging someone for mercy. "Just to help with the bills," my father said hurriedly, as if afraid I'd change my mind. "Maybe $1,000 a month." I almost choked on the water when I heard that amount. It was not just a significant commitment. It was exactly the same amount that Grandma Justina once sent me monthly to pay for housing during college, an amount that at that time seemed to me a treasure, a symbol of support and faith. But now, after the recent raises, bonuses, and those endless hours of work and dedication, I knew I could afford it without fear of being left destitute. "I can do this," I finally said, feeling a strange calmness fill me, as if, despite everything, I was once again in control of my life. I arranged an automatic monthly transfer so as not to turn it into a constant painful ceremony, and that evening my parents burst into tears of gratitude, hugging me warmly, repeating the words of love that they had once been so stingy to give. But I didn't feel anything in response. No warmth, no pain, no relief, just a vague, quiet feeling that I was doing the right thing, even though they probably didn't deserve it. The next day, I told Grandma Justine about my decision. expecting to hear criticism or at least a warning, but instead she just nodded and said with a slight smile, "You're better than them. And that's a reason to be proud." Over the next few months, I began to see my parents more often. Sometimes we had dinner together. Sometimes they invited me to lunch. Sometimes Mimi joined us, who came home from college for the holidays, and each time I was convinced that she hadn't changed at all. She was still selfish, still carefree and confident. Her exclusivity, while her parents still treated her like a princess, surrounding her with the attention, care, and delight that I could only dream of as a child. I was most impressed by her appearance: clothes from designer brands, well-groomed nails, which she obviously did in expensive salons, a new MacBook and the latest iPhone, which she flaunted without hesitation, as if they were everyday things, not luxury. I didn't say anything, just watched in silence, continuing to send money to my parents every month, allowing them to thank me with that excessive, forced gratitude that eventually began to seem empty to me, devoid of real feeling. Over time, they started asking for more, at first cautiously, in small amounts. "The car broke down," they said. "Could you help?" $200. Or, "The water heater is out of order. Is $350 too much?" I rarely refused, because my career continued to develop rapidly, and I told myself that it was just money, that I could afford such generosity without suffering damage to my goals. At work, I was assigned the largest project at that time, restructuring the approach to corporate clients, which loomed the prospect of another promotion, this time to head of department, and I threw myself into my work, spending all my energy and time on it, knowing that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Months of hard work were finally crowned with success. The project was completed, the results exceeded expectations, and the CEO of the company personally congratulated me, handing me a promotion and announcing that I was now heading the corporate relations department with a salary almost double what I had previously received. That evening, I bought an expensive bottle of wine, which I had never allowed myself before, and went to Grandma Justine's to celebrate this event with the very person who has always been by my side. "I'm so proud of you," she said, clinking her glass against mine, and tears of happiness shone in her eyes. "But promise me one thing: make time for yourself." "I will," I replied confidently, feeling relief spread through my body. "Maybe I'll even start dating again." "Hallelujah!" she exclaimed, laughing so sincerely that I involuntarily laughed with her, feeling that for the first time in a long time I was really living, and not just existing. It took a week before I found time to visit my parents again for dinner. Mimi returned home for the holidays, and I immediately noticed that she was wearing a new designer bag that probably cost more than my rent for the first month in my own apartment. At dinner, when the conversation turned to news and plans, I decided to share my achievement, hoping maybe to get real recognition for the first time. "I've been promoted," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but deep down, waiting. However, there was a strange, heavy silence at the table, as if my words had disappeared into thin air without reaching any ears, and only after a few long seconds did my mother say, "You know, with your new position, you probably could afford to help us a little more. Maybe $1,500 a month instead of $1,000? I couldn't help but laugh, thinking it was a joke, but when I looked at their serious faces, I realized, no, they are absolutely serious. "I've been helping you for several months now, covering all emergency expenses," I reminded him, feeling barely contained indignation begin to boil in my chest. Mimi, lazily leaning back in her chair, rolled her eyes with such disdain that I could barely contain myself. "Don't be so selfish, Alba," she said across the table. "You don't need that money." I looked at her $800 bag, her manicure, and her iPhone and realized that was enough. "No," I said firmly, not raising my voice, but with such confidence that no one dared to object. "The amount remains the same." The rest of the dinner was tense. There was a heavy, almost palpable silent disapproval in the air, and the three of us, like participants in some kind of protracted farce, exchanged glances that read resentment, indignation, and something else, an unspent expectation, perhaps the last hope that someone would give in, break. The first one. I left early, apologizing for the pressing business. But in fact, I could no longer bear the mournful atmosphere in which gratitude for my sacrifices so quickly turned into a sense of entitlement, as if by default I was obligated to give more and more, without the right to refuse. Months passed, filled with work and new goals, and I almost stopped thinking about those difficult conversations when one day my mother called me to invite Mimi to a college graduation dinner. Her voice was deceptively cheerful, and there was that painfully familiar note of expectation in her intonation, as if the invitation was hiding something more. I arrived expecting to see the guests, noise, and laughter that usually accompany such events, but to my surprise, the house was quiet, and only 4 people were sitting at the table: Mom, Dad, Mimi, and me. Mimi, beaming with pride, hurried to announce that she was planning to go to a luxury resort in Mexico in honor of her graduation, her voice full of delight and anticipation, and her eyes shone with the greedy light of a man who is used to getting everything he wants. Mom cleared her throat and, as if following a pre-prepared script, said, "We were hoping you'd pay for her trip as a graduation present." I stared at them, trying my best to keep a neutral expression on my face, even though cold anger was slowly building up inside me. "I beg your pardon?" I asked, making sure I understood correctly. "It would mean a lot to her," Dad added, sounding pleading, "after all her hard work." Mimi nodded impatiently, and then said without hesitation, "The package I want costs only $14,000. I put down my fork, realizing that this was far from just a whim, but a demonstration of how unlimited her rights to my achievements and my success seemed to her. Mimi has not earned a single cent in her entire life. She has never known what it means to get up at 5 in the morning, work hard, give up her pleasures for the sake of a goal. And now they were demanding that I finance her dream vacation. "If you don't help your sister," Mom said threateningly, her voice trembling with suppressed irritation, "don't consider yourself a part of this family anymore." I looked at them all, at my arrogant, spoiled sister, manipulative, cold mother, and weak, avoiding father's eyes, and instead of the pain I might have expected to feel, I felt only a slight, liberating relief. "That's fine with me," I replied calmly, getting up from the table. "And by the way, I'm also stopping monthly transfers. From now on, you will solve your own financial issues." I headed for the exit without turning around, and even though I could hear their shouts and shouts behind me, I didn't slow down for a moment, knowing that if I stopped, I would give them another opportunity to cling to my life. When I got home, I immediately opened the banking application and canceled the automatic transfer, feeling like with every keystroke I was freeing myself from the invisible chains that had been holding me all this time. Over the next few weeks, my phone wouldn't stop: calls, messages, letters, first with reproaches and accusations, then with pleas and apologies, and I didn't hesitate to block their numbers and send the letters to the trash, knowing that none of these words deserved my attention. About a month later, when I was almost used to the new silence, I received an invitation to Grandma Justina's 75th birthday party. She was hosting a big party, gathering friends and relatives from all over the country, and I knew that my parents would surely be there, because no matter what, Grandma remained my father's mother. And he wouldn't dare ignore such an important event. I debated for a long time whether it was worth going, but in the end I decided that in a large crowd of people we could successfully avoid each other, and my love and respect for my grandmother outweighed all doubts. On the day of the party, I wore my favorite blue dress, the one that Grandma always praised, saying that it accentuated my eyes, and brought her a gift, a hand-painted teapot, ordered from a local artist, knowing her passion for unique tea sets. When I arrived, the house was full of people, noisy, cheerful, animated with conversations and laughter, and immediately, glancing around the room, I noticed my parents and Mimi standing at the buffet, filling plates, arguing animatedly about something. They saw me too, but pretended not to notice, and turned away, eating with apparent indifference, which suited me fine. I went to my grandmother, who was sitting in her favorite chair, majestic and glowing in a purple dress with a small bodice pinned to her shoulder, like a queen at her own reception. "That's my girl," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with joy as I came closer and bent down to hug her. "Always on time, always thoughtful." I handed her my gift, which she immediately opened, and her admiration was so sincere that my heart was filled with warmth. She turned the hand-painted teapot in her hands, admiring the neat flowers and intricate patterns. "It's just fine," she said, smiling. "I'll use it tomorrow morning for tea." The party was pleasant. I talked to relatives I hadn't seen for many years, met with my grandmother's friends, some of their children and grandchildren, talked about my work, my life, shared smiles and memories, avoiding any intersections with my closest relatives. It was time for dinner, and everyone sat down at long tables decorated with flowers and candles. The meal began warmly, with light conversations and an exchange of dishes, and I was already beginning to think that the evening would pass without trouble. But when the main course was served, toasts began. One by one, people stood up, raised glasses and said kind words in honor of Grandma. When it was my mother's turn, she stood up, holding a glass of wine in her hand, and said, "To my wonderful mother-in-law on her 75th birthday. You have always been a source of wisdom in our family, and we are very grateful for your guidance throughout these years." Her words were beautiful, perfectly chosen, but there was an emptiness in them that I had already learned to recognize over the years of living next to her, and I had to make an effort not to roll my eyes right at the table. Then, to my horror, my mother, who was still standing with her glass raised and catching the eyes of the guests on her, turned in my direction, and in her voice, sounding unexpectedly loud in the silent hall, there was a fake solemnity that instantly chilled my skin. "And while I'm attracting everyone's attention," she said, looking pointedly around the room, "I'd like to say something." I froze, anticipating trouble, and my mother continued, carefully arranging each phrase, as if she had prepared this speech in advance. "My daughter Alba recently decided that family no longer means anything to her. Despite her financial success, she turned her back on us and refused to help her own sister with a simple graduation gift." There was a stunned silence, tense and viscous, as if the air in the room had suddenly become thick. All the faces turned towards me froze in awkward amazement, and my face burned with embarrassment and anger so brightly that it seemed to be visible even from the next room. Grandma Justina, who was sitting in her chair, abruptly straightened up and said in a voice that sounded steely for the first time all evening, "Vanna, this is not the time or the place. But you know, I've had enough." I stood up, and my chair creaked on the floor with such a sound that all eyes finally glued to me. I felt my heart tremble, but I knew that I could no longer remain silent. "Since my mom decided to show off our dirty laundry at Grandma's birthday dinner," I began, barely able to keep the tremor out of my voice, "let me make something clear." I slowly looked around the room, saw the confused faces of my relatives, those who were used to the outward splendor of our family and now did not know how to react. "For the last 3 years," I continued, enunciating each word carefully, "I've been sending my parents $1,000 a month. I believed that this money was going to pay for Mimi's college tuition." At that moment, his father's cousin, Martin, an influential and respected man who worked on the council of the state university, frowned and, putting down his fork, spoke. His voice sounded loud and clear. "This can't be happening. Mimi received a full scholarship under the Heritage Program. Your father informed me about it himself when she was accepted. All tuition and accommodation were fully paid for." For a few moments, there was a ringing silence in the hall, so complete that the candles on the tables could be heard crackling. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. Everything I believed in, everything I tried to help for, turned out to be a lie. And then the realization hit me with lightning clarity. That's why Mimi always had designer clothes, expensive accessories, the latest electronics, because my money, my sacrifices, my efforts were not used for needs, not to pay for education, but to continue to pamper her, as always. "They didn't use my money to pay for her tuition," I said slowly, almost in a whisper, feeling the rage building in me, turning into an unstoppable wave. "They used them to pamper her. As always." Grandma Justina, who was huddled in her chair, suddenly spoke. Her voice was quiet, but there was a threat of a storm in it. "Is that true?" My father started babbling, stumbling over each word. "That's not quite true. It's not what it seems." "And what exactly should it seem like?" I asked, finding my voice and feeling the shock in my soul quickly give way to icy rage. "You tricked me," I said, looking them straight in the eye. "You tricked me out of $36,000. You made me believe that I was helping to pay for my education, when in fact you were just financing Mimi's lavish lifestyle." Mom made a weak attempt to justify herself, her voice trembling. "We needed this money for the house, for the accounts." But Grandma Justina had already risen from her chair. Her small figure suddenly seemed imposing and implacable. "Bruno, Vanna," she said slowly and clearly, "I think you should leave." "Mom, please." Dad started, but Grandma interrupted him, her voice as hard as a rock. "You lied to your daughter. You took advantage of her success and generosity. You're not my son right now." She turned to Mimi, who had been staring at her plate the entire time, as if hoping that if she was quiet enough, she would disappear. "Did you know about this?" Mimi's silence was enough of an answer. "Get out of my house," Grandma finished, without raising her voice, but there was such undeniable authority in it that no one dared to disobey. My parents and Mimi hurriedly got up, their faces pale and confused. Mom was crying hard, Dad was blushing with shame, but Mimi still did not look up. Soon after, the guests began to leave the party one by one, coming up with awkward excuses to leave as quickly as possible without witnessing the final disintegration of the family. I stayed to help my grandmother clean up, and we worked side by side in silence, like old comrades after a hard battle. "I'm sorry," I finally managed, breaking the long silence. "I've ruined your party." Grandma looked at me with such warmth that I felt a lump in my throat. "Nonsense," she replied, patting my hand lightly. "You didn't ruin anything. They did everything themselves." In the weeks that followed, Grandma told me that her parents called her over and over again, begging for forgiveness, trying to change her mind about the will, but she remained firm, unyielding, like a cliff in the middle of a raging sea. "I've already changed it," she informed me one day, when we were sitting at the kitchen table, and she was pouring fragrant tea from her new painted teapot. "Everything is going to the fact that you are the only one who has shown true character in this family." I took a sip, feeling the slight bitterness of the drink on my lips and a strange combination of sadness and relief in my soul. "I never wanted things to go this far," I whispered. "Me too," Grandma sighed, her gaze sad but firm. "But we can't control other people's choices, Alba. We can only control our own decisions." From that day on, I didn't talk to my parents or Mimi anymore. Sometimes I saw their names on my phone screen, and sometimes I received messages full of promises and remorse, but I never replied, knowing that no matter what words they chose, it was too late for us. Write a comment on what you think about this story and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like it. See you soon.